The Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by CNMC, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat Commission.
Bernard Tobin here at Cereal Spartan. I'm in Kitchener-Waterloo today at the annual meeting, and joined now by agronomist consultant Phil Needham. Phil, thanks for stopping by.
Great to be here again.
Phil, you've traveled the world consulting on wheat, Europe, New Zealand. Tell us about the potential of winter wheat, especially in Ontario.
So I'd probably start out by saying I've ridden with combine operators in Ontario when a field yield is averaged, let's say 100 for a round number. But you'd be sitting in the combine cab watching a yield monitor that would be calibrated within reason, and the yield monitor, let's say, goes from 60 or 70 in the lower areas up to 120, 140, 150, maybe sometimes higher for short bursts on the high end. So often people say, well, flat out in Ontario, what's the yield potential? And I will always tell them, if you've seen 150 on a calibrated yield monitor, that's what your upper end yield potential is. Now your challenge is if your field average is 100, and you've got some that often makes 50% less and some that makes 50% more than the field average, then you've got a lot of opportunities to try and figure out why those differences occur. Is it fertility, for example, FOSS? Is it nitrogen limiting on the hillsides or the eroded hilltops, assuming a rolling field? Is it sulfur? Is it disease? Is it insects? Is it weeds? Is it lodging? Is it a combination of all of the above? And it frequently is. So I'd probably answer that best by saying a combine yield monitor in a field will give you a good perception of what the yield potential is, certainly within those higher regions within the field.
Now, Phil, today in your presentation, you talked about the components of yield. How do you create that potential? And first thing on your list was heads per square meter. What's our target in Ontario? What should it be?
So when you've got regions like Ontario, plus or minus 30, 35 inches of annual rainfall, which is a lot of Ontario, moisture is non-limiting. Other things will be limiting before moisture, obviously. So plus or minus 600 heads, good, clean heads, protected all the way until dry down or senescence, as we call it, with good fungicide programs. 600 would get you maximum yields. Now, I mentioned a little while ago, riding in a combine cab, yields going from 60 or 80, field average is 100, peak yields in higher productivity areas of the field that make 120, 140 or more. When you find an area in the field, you're running the combine, when you find areas within that field that are super high yielding compared to the field average, stop the combine for a minute or two, get yourself some flags, right on a flag, 150 bushel wheat, whatever that number is, stick the flag in the ground so you can return to that area later when you've got more time. Go back to that area, find the flag, count the number of stems, which should obviously be a function of number of heads, and get some head counts. What we nearly always see in lodged areas, there's a yield loss, depending on when it lodged and how long it was lodged and how bad it was lodged and if it stood back up or not. These are all factors that kind of spin off the topic. But the bottom line is if you got lodging, most times the wheat's too thick, and you can count the stems and determine that. But generally the sweet spot for maximum yields on a yield monitor in a field is plus or minus 600. And it can be a little less and a little higher, but 600 evenly distributed heads should get you maximum yields within a good rainfall region like Ontario.
Yeah. You also mentioned you focus on the number of spikelets per head.
Spikelets per head is really the second component of yield. Spikelets is obviously a function of the variety, the head population, the moisture, the temperatures early on at 30 to 31 growth stage when the heads are developing. But yeah, you've got to maximize the number of spikelets within the heads, and the growing season, the temperatures, the moisture would all have an impact on that, in addition to how well you're managing that canopy. So nitrogen, sulfur, these are both core components of plant health. FOSS too if you're in a low FOSS environment, but you've got to manage that crop to take full advantage of the growing season and the moisture you have with fertility to keep that plant healthy so it doesn't start dumping off some of the spikelets that sometimes happens in stressful environments, stress linked to fertility, that is.
You also talked about, the number of grains per spikelet and the weight of each grain, but you're really wrapped up with uniformity. That's the bottom line. You've got to have that uniform field.
Yeah, and when you start making counts in a field, counting heads, counting tillers, for example, stopping the combine, putting a flag in, doing those counts, those are really good to do because that gives you the data to see how good of a job you're doing with uniformity, because there's a lot of growers out there, including Ontario, that the head counts may go from 400 or 500 on the low end to lodging in areas with 1,000 or 1,200 or 1,500. And I see a lot of that in Western Canada too. There's probably some people going to be watching from Western Canada. Lodging 9 times out of 10 is caused by just having head counts that are beyond what you need for maximum yields. And you've got too many heads for the stems to sustain their standing. They fall over and it reduces the yield. So head counts is really important, an important part of field yields.
What about residue management, Phil? It has so many impacts, especially when the combine is not spreading that soybean residue evenly.
So I drove it from Detroit yesterday. It's about a 3-hour drive when the weather's good anyway. And there's a lot of soybean fields on either side of the 401 highway that don't have good residue spread. And they're not in wheat, but the bottom line is it just shows you that there's a lot of combines out there that aren't spreading residue the full width of the head. So and some of these guys are probably going to work it up in the spring, but some guys have got to be no-tilling, maybe corn back into those fields. If they planned at one time to plant wheat into those streaked soybean residue fields, there's all kinds of problems. When you've got heavy residue, the soil's cooler, it's wetter, it delays emergence, it delays development, it delays heading. So you've got a different growing environment altogether where the residue's heavier compared to little or no residue between the combine passes. So I've been to see combine manufacturers, I've been to lots of field days. Some of these are online on the RealAgriculture.com website where we're talking about managing residue. And there's lots of ways you can do it, but the biggest thing is just simple adjustments, making sure the knives are sharp, making sure everything's adjusted, the veins on the tailboard, but you physically just reach a limit at which you can't spread residue any wider than the width of the combine head. And at that point, you've got to select the combine head that the residue management system on the back of the combine can spread residue over, and no head wider than that. And a lot of combines don't spread residue wider than 33 or 35 feet. So putting a 40-foot head or a 45-foot head on that combine is pointless because you're going to streak the residue and hurt the following yields, especially if it's no-till.
Final thing I want to mention is doing stand counts. You mentioned it's so important, going back to an earlier point about establishing that stand and head count. You got to get out there, do multiple head counts, do the average, and really get a sense of your fields and your farm.
Yeah, you've got to do head counts. I consider myself a specialist in that just because I do a lot. But it tells you two things. Number one, it tells you the number on an average within that field so you can make management decisions with spring nitrogen in the field. You can dribble on nitrogen with stream bars earlier if it's thinner. If it's later, you put the nitrogen on a little bit later. But the bottom line is it gives you a sense or an understanding how uniform that field is. If you need 250 plants per square yard or 10% more if it's per square meter, for example, I want that same population all the way across the field. I don't want 150 here and 250 there. So just doing the stand counts gives you a level of understanding of what you need to do in that field from a point of view of managing that crop from then on out. To see what kind of a job you did at seeding time.
Yeah. So and it goes back to uniformity again. Phil, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate the time.
It's a pleasure. Great to see you again.